When Viking pirates landed on the north coast of France in 911, they were pagan warriors intent on seizing land. Over the next 300 years, these men of the north, or Nordmen as the French called them, or Normans as we know them, transformed Western civilization, bringing about dramatic changes in social structure, culture, and warfare, and had influences as far afield as the Holy Lands, Sicily, and Scotland. The Viking leader, Ralph, or Rollo as the French called him, led his men up the Seine in their magnificently designed longboats and seized land throughout the Seine Valley. They tried to penetrate further into France, but were beaten off. It appeared to be a stalemate. The Vikings could not advance any further. The French could not force them out. Rollo's men confronted the French army on the banks of the river Epte. The French king, Charles III, sent a message to Rollo, saying he could keep the land he had already ransacked if he agreed to adopt Christianity. Rollo accepted the offer. Tradition says that the official ceremony was held at the nearby church of St. Clair, and so the part of France we still know today as Normandy was established. The Normans loved hunting, and the wide areas of forest across Normandy were full of game, birds, deer, and wild boar which they hunted with hawks and hounds. Rouen, the main city in Normandy, became a flourishing trading city, and many more Viking settlers brought produce from Scandinavia and the Viking ports of northern England. You can tell how prosperous the city was by the great churches and abbeys built there. Rollo's tomb is in Rouen. Various dukes struggled to bring order to Normandy by binding together the ruler and the ruled. This was called feudalism. Through solemn oaths, the strong agreed to defend the weak to support the strong. Peasants tilled the fields that were given to the lords by the Duke of Normandy. The lords set up castles as frontiers throughout Normandy to protect the people and the land which were now theirs. Probably the most famous and influential of the Normans was William the Bastard, later to become William the Conqueror. His mother was a peasant woman, his father, Duke Robert. The Duke had a castle in Falaise. One day, from his castle, he noticed Arletta at a stream washing her clothes. He fell in love with her, and although he could not marry her, they had a son, hence William the Bastard. When William was 7, Robert died, and he became Duke. William inherited many enemies who wanted to steal his wealth and power. He had to flee many times from the castle, but he survived, and at the age of 20, he was safely on the throne, having crushed those who had defied him. William realized that his work of restoring order was worthless unless he had the support of the church. His work had to have a godly purpose. He had to present his people with a picture of what organized Christian life was like. To do this,
he gave land to the church and built monasteries throughout Normandy.
The Normans then were Christian and French-speaking and had come a long way from the Viking raiders who had pillaged Christian churches. They now saw themselves as God's warriors. Their mission in life was to shape and defend a well-ordered society in which the church could flourish. Meanwhile, across the Channel in England, Edward the Confessor was king. He had spent many years in Normandy and he got on well with William. Now, Edward didn't have any children, and fearing the threat of a Viking invasion, he offered the succession of his crown to William, who he knew would close the Channel to the Vikings.
Edward's brother-in-law and chief advisor was called Harold. In 1064, Edward sent him to the continent on a mission. The waters became rough, and Harold's boat was shipwrecked. He was saved by French sailors and imprisoned by a court. William heard of this and arranged for Harold's release. Harold stayed in Normandy as William's guest, and as the centre of the Bayeux Tapestry shows, made an oath to support William when he became King of England. What the tapestry does not show is whether or not Harold was forced to take the oath.
In 1065, there was a revolt in the north of England, and Harold's brother Tostig, who was the Earl of Northumberland, was made an outlaw and escaped to Flanders.
Edward was old and sick, and on his deathbed it is said that he changed his mind about William being his successor. Instead, he promised the throne to Harold. Edward died on the 5th of January, 1066. The King's Council unanimously supported Harold as king, and later that month he was crowned Harold I of England.
Long live the King! Long live King Harold!
William was furious, and at his castle in Falaise he planned to attack England. He gathered support amongst his barons and even got the Pope's blessing. He ordered ships to be built and gathered food, weapons and horses for his army.
Harold expected an invasion, and he posted his soldiers on the south coast of England. William, however, was not his only threat. In September of that year, Harold's exiled brother Tostig joined forces with the King of Norway and invaded the north of England and advanced on York. Harold moved his army northwards and defeated his attackers, but in moving his army north, the south coast lay undefended.
When the winds were right, the Norman fleet set sail, carrying men, horses, weapons, and 6 prefabricated wooden castles. They arrived at Pevensey Bay and then sailed on to Hastings. There was nobody to fight them off, so they set up camp.
Harold's men marched the 240 miles south, and on the evening of October the 13th set up camp on a hill just outside Hastings. They were weary,
but they intended to launch a surprise attack on William's men the next day. However, the Norman scouts spotted Harold's men, and early the next morning, the Normans attacked. The battle lasted all day. The English were on foot and used spears and battle axes. The Normans also had foot soldiers, many of them archers, but they also had knights on horseback. The horsemen trained as fighters from an early age. They could crash into the enemy infantry and hack them down. They were like tanks. Harold was clever. He made his men make a ring on the hilltop and use their shields to form a wall. The Normans then had to attack up the hill, which not only slowed them down, but enabled the English to shower them with spears and hatchets. Many Norman horses reared and fell. Word spread that William was dead, but he lifted his helmet and urged his men on. He told his archers to creep forward and shoot arrows high into the air to fall on the heads of the English. Again and again the Normans attacked. Harold was struck by an arrow, and soon after the Normans broke through the English defences. Harold was killed, and victory was William's. After the Battle of Hastings, William expected the English to surrender. They didn't. He had to march on London to force them to give him the crown. William soon started to impose his own order on the English. He sheared away not only the English aristocracy, but also village landlords. In their place he installed his comrades from battle, French-speaking lords with their own customs and way of life. They were conquerors in a hostile land. The Normans found greatest difficulty in gaining control of the north of England. In 1069, King William's friend and close ally, Robert de Conin, was made Earl of Northumberland and travelled to Durham to take possession. He had 700 men with him. Robert was warned that the locals would set a trap, but he went on. Surely nobody could stop the Normans. The next morning, Robert and all his men had been murdered. This was the last straw for William. The Normans turned Durham into a fortress. They built a castle on the River Wear, set up a monastery, and built an astonishing cathedral. The castle proclaimed that they were masters of the land, the cathedral that God was on their side. England was fringed by Celtic neighbours. The Welsh were strong fighters, and they resisted the Normans fiercely. So it is no surprise that the Welsh border has more remains of Norman castles than anywhere else in England. A fine example is the border town of Ludlow. It was attacked many times, but in more peaceful times it developed into a flourishing trading place and market town. The Normans found South Wales easier to penetrate than the north. The broad plains allowed the powerful cavalry to advance at speed, and they were also able to ship supplies in across the Bristol Channel. By the time King Henry I was on the throne, the Normans had progressed into the remotest parts of southwest Wales. Pembroke was given by the king to the Clare family, and a magnificent castle was erected. North Wales is more mountainous, and the dense forests meant the Welsh could harass the Normans. The North Welsh resistance was only undermined by continuous wars between the Welsh chieftains. When Edward I came to the throne, he was fed up with the continuous Welsh resistance, and he moved into North Wales, erecting 17 of the most fortified castles ever seen. In 1301, at Carnarvon Castle, he crowned his eldest son Prince of Wales, a tradition kept up ever since. In the mid-11th century, Scotland was ruled by Macbeth. You may have heard of him. He was defeated and succeeded by Malcolm Campbell, who was King of Scotland at the time of the Battle of Hastings. He gave refuge to a lot of the fleeing English, including royalty. In fact, he even married one of them, Margaret, at Dunfermline. The Normans and the Scots both wanted to rule Northumberland and Cumbria, in what is now the far north of England. The Normans built impressive castles and monasteries at Banbury, Lindisfarne, and Carlisle. The Scots attacked them many times, but the Normans strengthened the castles and held fast. They were content to leave the further north to the Scots, but the boundaries of Norman England were firmly established and are still in place today. Malcolm realized that if Scotland were to remain independent, it would have to become more like Norman England. Monks were invited in so that Malcolm could form an alliance with the church. When Malcolm's son David became king, he brought in Norman craftsmen and architects, and slowly the Norman influence crept into Scotland. The links developed. King David's sister married a son of William the Conqueror. He became King Henry I of England. The toughest problem for the kings of Scotland was controlling the southwest, Galloway. The local leaders claimed independence and called themselves kings. Malcolm's answer was to copy the Normans by settling loyal knights in the area. One such family of knights were the Bruces, who were the ancestors of Robert the Bruce, a Scottish king whose name is now a symbol of Scottish pride, yet his name is taken from the town of Brice in France. Most Normans settled in the lowlands, but eventually they established themselves in the highlands, and their descendants are still there. Sinclair, Ramsay, Lindsay, Berkeley, Graham are all names we think of as Scottish, but again, they are of Norman origin.
The Viking pirates who had settled in France then had changed boundaries and restructured the Western world. Military might, religion and commerce were their mainstays, and their legacy is still with us today.